Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this pre-recorded webinar on preparing for your interview. My name's Catherine Thumnell and I'm the Admissions Director at Sydney Sussex College. And what we're going to do over the course of the next few minutes is try and put your mind at ease about the preparations that you might make for your interview, which hopefully is approaching in the next few weeks. We're going to cover a few different things within this presentation. I'm going to talk a little bit about what you can expect within your interview, so what it might look like, who might be in there, and what kinds of questions broadly you might expect. I also want to talk a little bit about how the interview fits into our wider admissions processes. So hopefully to remind you that this is just one part of a wider process of admission selection, and it's not something that you need to worry unduly about, and it's not something that is the be-all and end-all of your application to Cambridge. So, as you may already be aware, we have a lot of information about you as part of the applications process. You might remember back when you submitted your UCAS application on the 15th of October, you produced quite a lot of information that fitted into that application form. And that tells us quite a lot. So within that, we see things like your academic record to date. So you will have told us information about your GCSE results, for instance, or your predicted grades for what you're doing at A level, or whatever qualification you happen to be doing at the moment. This is helpful to us. As you may already know, we don't have specific GCSE requirements, so you don't have to have a certain number of A's or A stars at GCSE, or 7s or 8s or 9s. In order to be competitive in your application to us, but it is helpful to have that indication of how you've been doing at school and the last big examinations that you took to feed into our decision-making process. Also, your teachers will have provided some predicted results for you for the qualifications that you're currently doing. And again, that's really helpful to us in seeing how it is that you're coping with those qualifications that you're taking at the moment. And hopefully your teachers have predicted you really strong grades that are going to really smash our entry requirements. So again, within your UCAS form, you will have given us a personal statement. And I imagine that blood, sweat and tears went into placing every single semicolon in that personal statement. And it's helpful to us because as part of our applications process, we're really interested in assessing your motivation for and enthusiasm for the course that you've applied for. And your personal statement is, I suppose, the starting point for showing us a little bit about your voice and your interest in your subject. So the kinds of things that you wrote in there were very helpful to us, and we use that in our applications process to see a little bit about your suitability for the course that you've applied for. Also, your school will have provided us with a reference. So they'll have told us a little bit about how you perform within school, so where you are within your cohort, and kinds of information that are appropriate to the subject that you've applied to. So things that we can take on board, because realistically your teachers have known you for an awful lot longer than we see you. Our admissions process might feel like it lasts for a long time, but actually it's only running from the middle of October to the middle of January in the year that you're applying. And your teachers have known you for a bit longer than that. So we pay attention to the kinds of comments that they make about you within your school reference. Unless you applied for mathematics or for music, you will have taken or will be about to take an admissions assessment in your subject. And we use admissions assessments to really give us information on a gathered field of applicants, all of whom are likely to achieve our entry requirements and certainly will have very strong academic records to date. And we have people who apply to us from across the world, and the admissions assessments give us an extra piece of information to differentiate between a really well-qualified field. So if you've already taken yours, that's great, you don't need to worry about it anymore. And if you're in a subject that requires you to take one at interview, then it's a good idea to refresh your memory about what kind of material might be covered by looking on the university web pages. For some of our subjects, we will also have asked you to submit some written work in advance of your application. And the college that you've applied to will have told you details about exactly what's required in your subject. And that's quite useful to us as well, because it's another piece of information that we have that shows how you communicate in your subject, how you argue in prose perhaps, and how you take on board the information that your teachers have given you in response to the work that you've done. So all of this information is something that you've already provided us with, or is something that you will be providing us with very, very shortly. And that's quite a lot. So quite a lot of time and investment has gone into this already. And your performance at interview, there's a reason that it's the last thing on this list, and there's a reason that it's included alongside all of the rest of this information. The interview is just one thing that we use to assess your application, and we look at it always alongside the information that you've already given to us. So we never look at your interview performance in isolation, and we never look at any element of your academic record or anything that you've given us as part of your application in isolation. We really do aim for a holistic assessment of your application when you come along to us. So your performance at interview is one part of that, and it's one of the most heavily talked about parts of our admissions process. And you might be feeling a little bit nervous about your interview, and that's absolutely fine. So what we want to do in the rest of this presentation is tell you a little bit in more detail about why we interview, why we put you through this terrible ordeal, and what it is that we're trying to get at, and hope that you might then think about how the interview could be a really positive and enjoyable experience for you, rather than something to be really dreadful and to be terrified about. So we interview at this university because we're really fortunate to receive applications from many, many excellent applicants who are all really well qualified, and many of whom would really thrive on our courses. And what we have to do within all of our admissions process, not just the interview, is try and fairly distinguish amongst all of these excellent applicants by trying to piece together different elements of their approach to their subject. So we do it so we have an extra piece of information about you, an extra way of thinking through your approach to your subject. The interview is also really helpful to us because it's one way that we can get at some of the skills that you might need for studying at university, and this university in particular. So we might use your interview to explore a little bit about whether you understand the course that you've applied for, whether it's the kinds of questions that we might ask you might well be reflective of the course content that you might then have if you come on and study with us. We also want to explore your motivation for studying your degree. At the moment, you're probably feeling really enthusiastic and positive about going to university, and that's wonderful. There may be times, however, when it's February and it's cold and it's dark and you've got 3 essays due in a week, where maybe you're not feeling quite so positive about the world of university. And we really want you to be motivated to study your subject, even when it's hard, even when it's challenging, and even when you've got lots and lots to do. We do have quite intense courses at the University of Cambridge. So we have you with us for 8-week terms, 3 8-week terms a year. And that means that those term time periods while you're with us require you to work quite hard. So we want students who will approach their studies diligently, and we want you to be conscientious in your approach. So that means that one of the things we're going to look at interview is how you approach different kinds of problems. You know, whether you're likely to keep on working through problems even when they're challenging, whether you're going to keep on trying. And that can be really helpful to us in working out whether this is the right sort of course for you. Interviews also try and touch upon relevant problem solving and critical thinking abilities. Now that sounds perhaps a little bit generic, but I suppose one way you can think about an interview is like an oral aptitude test for your subject. So the questions that you're going to be asked in your interview will, by and large, be about your subject. And they'll be asking you to work through appropriate problems for that subject and just test you a little bit, just try and probe you a little bit to see how you think and how you work through different ideas. It's often the case that you might find your interview quite challenging because we are going to push you a little bit beyond the kinds of material that you're already familiar with at school. As I said earlier, the reason that we interview is that we know you're already doing fantastically at school, and that's wonderful for you. So what we want to do is work out, okay, let's push you a little bit and take you right to the edge of your knowledge so far and your critical thinking so far, and see how you respond to some new information that you haven't seen before. And in some subjects, it might also be appropriate to think through your current knowledge base. So a good thing to do to work out what to look over from your schoolwork before you come to an interview is to go again to the university web pages. There is a wealth of knowledge and information on the university web pages for undergraduate admissions. And if you click on your subject, you can see information about all the different kinds of things that are in there. In some subjects, you will have taken an admissions assessment, and that assessment has a specification associated with it. For some of our subjects, like natural sciences, for instance, there's a kind of assumed knowledge base that it might be worth taking a little look over. But for many of our subjects, we don't assume that you have any current knowledge about your degree, particularly if you've never studied that subject before. So you don't need to worry too much if you're applying for something like law and you've never studied it before. That's not a problem at all. There's nothing that you then need to go on and revise and prepare for in advance of your interview. So when we get to this point of interview, there are a few things that we're looking to try and assess within those short moments that we have together. So what we're really trying to do is assess your academic ability and your potential to be successful on our course. And we might do that by asking you some questions that are quite tough about your subject and getting you to think through some material that you haven't encountered before. It's going to be relevant, it's going to be linked to the course that you are studying, but that doesn't mean that it's predictable. That doesn't mean that you can revise for and anticipate the questions that we ask for you. So we're looking at your academic ability and we're looking at your potential through the questions that we're trying to ask you, through the subject-specific questions that we're trying to ask you. We also, within an interview, want to really get you to show yourself to be self-motivated and committed and serious about the course that you're studying. So have a think and remind yourself about why you chose it in the first place. And think about being prepared to articulate some of that enthusiasm and motivation for your subject. Think about why you want to study it and practice, perhaps, talking to people about those academic interests that you have so you can convey something of that enthusiasm and motivation for your subject in a setting that's analogous to an interview. We want our students, we want our undergraduates to be able to think independently and to be able to think critically. So in much of the interview environment, there might not be any right answers to the questions that we're going to ask you, particularly in the arts and humanities and social sciences side of things. We might ask you some questions to which there is simply no right answer. And so quite often we're looking at the ways in which you approach that question, you approach that problem that we've set you. Can you think through it independently, or are you looking for something like a steer from your interviewer to decide where your views lie? Can you critically engage with the material that we provide you with, so you can say something sensible about what is limited about it, or maybe what might be quite persuasive about it? And this is really similar to the way in which we expect our students to learn within our supervision system, so our small group teaching system. So again, this is why the interview fits in very well, and it helps us to really explore what we're looking for in our undergraduates by having something similar in that teaching system when we assess you for admission in the first place. So in general, what we're going to ask you to do is use all of the existing knowledge that you have from the many, many things that you've been doing in preparation for applying to university to assess some problems that you haven't encountered before. So your existing knowledge might be partly the kinds of things that you learned at school. It might be partly the kinds of things that you've been doing in your A-levels or in your IB or whatever qualifications you're taking. And it might ask you to look askance or to look slightly differently at some information that you haven't seen before. You might also bring in material from the kind of supercurricular engagement that you've been doing as part of preparing to apply to university. So all that reading that you've been doing, all those online courses that you've been looking at, any, if it's appropriate, work experience that you've been doing, all of that is knowledge that you already have. So it's not like you come into the interview cold. You already know stuff, and you can come into the interview and you can use all of that information and select it appropriately to assess and evaluate and talk through some of the new problems that we're going to present you with. So often it's the case that we don't expect you to have seen the things that we're going to be talking about before, but what we are going to do is see whether you can work out the principles that you already know, the principles that you already have, to make sense of what we've given you. And finally, and quite helpfully, we also want you to be able to demonstrate that you can work through some difficult issues in dialogue. So in things like the arts and humanities and social sciences, as I've already said, there may be no right answer to a question that we're asking you. That doesn't mean that your interviewers are going to not ask you any questions. They're going to encourage you to think critically about the answers that you give. So if they're asking you questions back and saying, okay, what about if we think about this differently? Or is there another way that we can approach this problem? They're trying to encourage you to think through issues by talking to them. It's not like an interview is like university challenge where you give the answer and the question is over and you move on to the next one. It's about working through these problems together and trying to get them to build in complexity and build in interest by talking to your interviewer. So you can ask your interviewer questions, you can ask for clarification, and you can talk back and you can disagree if you want to. If you find yourself in a position where you've made a point and you're quite happy with that point, and then you're presented with overwhelming evidence to the contrary that you might have gone for a slightly misguided point in the first place, that's absolutely fine as well. You're allowed to change your mind, and that is entirely a sign of intellectual flexibility and being able to work through some of these difficult issues in dialogue. In something like the sciences and technology subjects, so things like maths and computer science and engineering, you are very much more likely to be asked to work through those difficult issues in dialogue with a pen and paper to hand as well. So sometimes in those interviews, we give you a problem to work through, and that problem might scale in its complexity, so it might get harder as you progress through the problem. So we might give you something to which there are multiple possible solutions. It wouldn't matter which one of those you chose, but we're interested in the ways in which you approach that problem and think it through. And then we might give you something that makes it a little bit more complicated, or that changes the initial conditions, or that makes you think through a different approach to the problem, an approach that you're taking at the moment. And listening to your interviewer and taking on board the comments that she or he is making in response to what you're saying is part of that admissions interview process. You shouldn't worry about your interviewer asking you for more information or asking you for questions or even for disagreeing with you, because what we're trying to get you to do is do all of the things that we're talking about here, to think independently, to think critically, and to work through some of these interesting issues. So I want to move on a little bit now to talk about what your interview might look like. So the kinds of things to expect when you walk through the door. So interviews vary a little bit, and the college that you're being interviewed at will have given you information about exactly what your interview is going to look like, how long it will last, where you're supposed to be, how you're supposed to prepare for it, and who is going to be in there. So the advice I'm going to give you now is general, it's an average, but as with all of averages, there's a kind of departure from it depending on which college you're particularly applying to. So if in doubt and you don't know what's happening in your interview, contact the college that you've applied to. So typically, you would expect to have 2 or maybe 3 admissions interviews when you come to Cambridge or when you're interviewed. And it's generally 2, but sometimes it can be 3. And typically they last anywhere between 20 and 45 minutes. Probably on average, they last about 25-30 minutes. Now, if you're looking at that thinking, oh my goodness, how am I going to find anything to talk about for 25 minutes? Don't panic. This process goes really, really, really quickly. And you might be really surprised to find that actually your interview has gone like a flash, and you might have really enjoyed this kind of cut and thrust and these questions that you've been responding to, or these problems that you've been step by step working through. So if you've got 2 or 3 interviews, and they typically last between 20 and 45 minutes, that gives you a sense of how you're going to have to pace yourself during the day. So think about how that's going to work and how you're going to make sure you keep up your energy levels while you're doing it, and just prepare yourself and find chance to relax between these interviews that are happening. Within the interview itself, there's normally 2 interviewers. Sometimes it can be 1, sometimes it can be more than 2, but in general, it's mostly likely to be the case that you'll be interviewed by 2 people. And those 2 people are going to be academics in your subject who are appropriate for interviewing you in those particular things that you're applying for. And you will be the only candidate in the room. We don't have any kind of group interviews where you have to interact or compete with any other applicants. You're the only applicant. There is likely to be 2 interviewers in general. And those interviewers are going to be people who are qualified to ask you suitable questions about your subject. And so they'll do the kinds of things within that interview that we've already talked about. They'll talk through those problem-solving scenarios, and you'll have a discussion within the interview that's relevant to the course that you applied to. An interview is interactive. That is, you're going to have to do some talking within the interview. And so we want you to be able to convey these things that we've stressed and stressed and stressed already. your interest for the course that you've applied to, your motivation for studying it. Even when it's dark and it's February and you're really tired, are you still interested in that subject? They're going to assess your skill in that subject, your aptitude in that subject. And that looks partly at what you've done already, and it also looks partly at how you can apply that knowledge to a new set of situations. So it's trying to get at this idea of your academic potential. If it's appropriate, we'll look at any core knowledge that you might have and any technical skill that we like you to demonstrate. So it's a good idea for subjects that involve mathematical skills to brush up on those mathematical skills, and particularly to make sure that you're able to talk through how you are approaching problems. So if you are in an interview where you're being asked to solve a problem with a pen and paper, it's a really good idea to get used to verbalizing your thoughts as you approach that problem. So to try and sort of talk aloud how you're approaching a problem, rather than sitting there silently and sweating and hoping that we solve the problem by itself. And that then, if you are prepared to articulate your thoughts as you're approaching a problem, gives your interviewer the chance to intervene and say, and correct you if you're going down the wrong route, or a route that's likely to be really, really difficult for you. That's not a problem if your interviewer sort of jumps in and says, maybe think about this in a different way. And also it shows your capacity to listen in discussion, and that's something that's really important to us when we then come on and teach our undergraduates and want them to engage in small group teaching, where they are also going to have to talk, they're also going to have to show their critical thinking and independent thinking, they're also going to have to solve problems, and they're certainly going to make mistakes. So their ability to listen is absolutely fine. Making mistakes is not a problem in life, and certainly not a problem in admissions. So the kinds of questions that you might get kind of vary a little bit by subject. So I want really to outline here some general principles before talking a little bit more in detail about the kinds of interviews that you might have if you're on the sciences side of things, and the kinds of interviews that you might have if you're on the arts and humanities and social sciences side of things. But before I do that, I really want to reiterate that your interviewers are not trying to trick you. There is no hidden agenda in the interview. There are no trick questions. And this is just one part of a much bigger admissions process. So the kinds of questions that you get in your interview, if someone asks you a question and you think, goodness me, that's much too easy a question for someone to be asking me. I must think of something that's much more complicated and impressive to say in response. Don't worry about it. Your interviewer is just trying to get you to start talking. So if you think an initial question is quite an easy question, just give the answer. If your interviewer wants to know more from you, then he or she will ask you more questions to follow up from that. So you should expect the questions to be challenging. Your interview is a really enjoyable experience, I hope, for all concerned, because we really enjoy meeting you and asking you challenging questions and seeing you talk through and think through ideas. And often you have fantastic original ideas in interviews, and it's really enjoyable to see you working through these things. But obviously, if you're thinking through something for the first time, that can be quite challenging. That can be something that you're going to have to think a little bit about. So it'll be focused on your subject, but it might not be the kinds of questions that you've been used to answering before. So it might not be the kinds of things that you've been doing as part of your school exams or things like that. It's absolutely fine if your interviewer prompts you and asks you to respond or do something differently and gives you questions from maybe different angles. So just to sum this section up, your interviews generally try and cover academic work, so the kinds of core knowledge, if it's appropriate, that you've already got. They often cover your reading and your other supercurricular exploration. So if you wrote about those kinds of things in your personal statement, then it's a really good idea to remind yourself what your personal statement said, and certainly to make sure that you have done the things that you said you were doing in your personal statement at the point at which you wrote it. So make sure that you've had a look over that material again and feel confident in talking about it. They're going to talk a little bit about your wider awareness of your subject. So that's really the kinds of new material that we're asking you to use your existing knowledge to make sense of. And sometimes, actually really quite commonly across a wide range of interviews, we might ask you to respond to what's called prompt material. And prompt material is really a tool for us to be able to get you to think about something that perhaps you haven't seen before. And prompt material can take a wide variety of different forms. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So if you're thinking now about how you prepare for this interview, what I hope we've shown so far is that your interview is part of a wider process, and it's something that is an academic engagement that is going to ask you to do things that are challenging, it's going to ask you to work through things in dialogue, and it's going to ask you to solve some problems that are related to your subject. So you might be thinking, okay, I kind of have a sense of what might be approaching me, so what do I do? What can I do to make myself feel better about this before I turn up in the first few weeks of December? So one good thing to do might be to remind yourself a little bit about the course that you've applied for, because when you submitted your UCAS application, you will have applied for up to 5 university choices, and those courses might be different or differ in their particular contents between the universities that you've applied to. So have a little look and remind yourself what the Cambridge course was like, because that might give you a little bit of an indication of the kinds of things that you thought were exciting about it in the first place. So sort of spur you on to think through those ideas again. It's a really good idea to look over your recent school and college work. That doesn't mean you need to revise it as such. You're not going to be assessed on your recall of your school or college work. That's not what we're assessing here. Your school qualifications do that. We assess things in a slightly different way, as I've already said. But it might make you feel a little bit more comfortable about all the knowledge and all the experience and all the information you already know about that you can then use to apply to these new situations we're going to confront you with. And particularly if you have submitted any work within the applications process, it's definitely a good idea to read over that submitted work again before you come and talk to us, because sometimes in some interviews that submitted work can be the basis of some interview questions. And because you submitted that work, we hope that you feel reasonably comfortable in discussing it. So it's a good idea to make sure that you are comfortable in discussing it by reminding yourself what you wrote. Your UCAS personal statement never leaves you. It's one of those kinds of things that stays with you for a long time, and it's one of the things that's a really useful thing for us to look at in our applications process. So obviously we looked at it when you first submitted it, and we might well look at it again for the interview. So sometimes interviewers will ask you questions about things that you have written in your personal statement to get you to start thinking through some of these ideas. Sometimes that's to relax you and to get you to start talking and to feel comfortable and to talk through something that you wrote and that you are confident about. But it can also be to get you to think a little bit beyond your personal statement. So to press you about some of the kinds of things that you've done or read or engaged with in a wider subject context. So certainly look back over your personal statement and make sure that you're happy to talk about any of the kinds of things in there that you commented on in the first place. So with all that in mind, probably the most useful thing that you can do to make sure that you feel confident in engaging with the interview is to practice talking to people. And that practice of talking to people is not intended to be a rehearsal for the interview. Definitely not. We don't want you to come in and sort of give us a prepared speech that you've written in the hope that we might ask you a question that allows you to sort of shove it in there somewhere. But one of the things that might feel a little bit different about an interview than the kinds of things you've done before is that maybe you haven't spent that much time talking to your friends or your teachers about your academic work and about your ideas. So practice doing that. Practice talking through why you're interested in something. Practice responding to some questions. Practice finding some problems and articulating how you would approach your sort of answer to those problems. And if you can do it with a friend, or if you can do it with a teacher, or if you can do it with a parent or carer, then that's absolutely fine. It doesn't really matter who it is that you're talking to. The point is that you are getting used to talking. You are getting used to talking about these intellectual ideas and how you approach the things that we're going to ask you about at interview. It's unlikely that you'll predict exactly the question that we're going to ask you. That's not the point of practicing it. The point is that you're comfortable in that situation of articulating and verbalising your approach to academic ideas. And if you're applying to a vocational subject, so essentially if you're applying to something like medicine or veterinary medicine, then it's also appropriate to include within that wider idea of discussing academic work, also to be able to reflect on any work experience that you did as part of as part of preparing to apply for those vocational subjects. So I just want to talk very quickly now about what interviews look like on a subject-specific basis, and to give you some ideas of the kinds of things that you might be asked. It's by no means exhaustive as a list of possible interview questions, but it does give you a few ideas of how you can practice talking about the kinds of things that might relate to your academic interests. So it might point you in the direction of something that you can look at before you come to interview, and think about how you talk through your responses to those things. So subject-specific interviews can include all of these different kinds of questions. So as I've already said, there might be a discussion of the academic interests that you talked about in your personal statement. And sometimes that's kind of an early question that your interviewers ask you in the interview. So you come through the door, you've got yourself settled, you've had the structure of the interview explained to you, and this is hopefully question that you feel comfortable in responding to because you wrote your personal statement and these are your academic interests that you said that you really cared about. So we hope that you might be sort of happy to talk through those kinds of ideas. There's no guarantee that you'll be asked a question about a personal statement, but it's something to certainly be prepared for. There might be challenging questions related to the material that you've done at school. So when you submitted your supplementary application questionnaire, you will have filled in a little box that tells us the kinds of topics that you've studied in your subjects to date. And so we might look at that information and ask you some questions about what you've learned within those contexts. And again, that's something that could be in any kind of interview. It might happen, it might not happen, but do think about the ways in which you might talk about the things that you've recently been studying at school. All interview questions and all interviews ask you to some extent to apply the existing knowledge that you have to a new set of situations, and that can take a really wide variety of forms. So in sciences, and in maths and in computer science and in engineering and sometimes in economics as well, you might actually be given some problems to work through. So that's where I mean you have a pen and a piece of paper to work through, and we might give you a task, give you a problem to solve. And that problem may well have stages to it that may increase in complexity. So you can practice doing that. You can talk to your teachers, you can think about problems that you think are interesting from the subjects that you've done so far, and you can try and solve those problems while also verbalizing your ideas, while also trying to talk through your approach to things like that. The university makes available lots of fantastic resources for what interviews look like. There's a video that you can look at on the university webpage, and that gives you an idea of the kind of problems that you might be asked to work through. But there are also resources on the university web pages through something like HE+, where you can go and click on your subject and you can look at things that are related to your subject and maybe practice talking through or thinking through some of the problems that are presented there. In the arts subject, so subjects like history and English, you might well be given something to look at before the interview or during the interview, or both. So if you're given a text to discuss, you'll be given detailed information about how much time you have to do that. So sometimes in some subjects we might give you 30 minutes to look through a short academic article that's related to your subject, and you'd have time to read that quietly and to go through it and to make notes on it, and then that would be the starting point for interview discussion. And that's really, really similar to the kinds of teaching that we do. The supervision system is often based on the kinds of things that you've read and thought about during the course of that week, and then the discussion that we have about that builds on your views from that. So practice doing it. Practice looking at texts. Doesn't really matter what kind of thing you pick, as long as you're practicing that process of comprehension, a critical approach, and critical thinking to the text that you then go on and try. So, take a look at some introductory level academic journals in your subject, or take a look at something like The Economist, or take a look at any of those resources for supercurricular engagement that might be helpful, and think about how you would discuss that, think about how you would pull something out from that. In the sciences too, it can sometimes be the case that we might give you a thing in the interview to look like, give you a specimen. And that could be really wide ranging. So you might perhaps in an earth sciences related interview be given a rock to discuss and something to talk through. In something like medicine or biology, you might be given a photograph of a cell to talk through. It's also sometimes the case that you might be given one of those little molecular models to hold and talk through as well. This is again to get you talking, to act as a starting point for discussion. We don't expect that you've seen these things before and that you know exactly what it is that you're going to say in response. The point is that it's an unseen exercise that you then respond to with all the information you bring to your interview. So this gives you a little bit of things, a little bit of scope to start your discussion off. And again, the conversation will build from that. And again, this is something that's quite similar to the teaching that we then go on and do. And it's also possible that we might discuss any of the submitted work that you gave us as part of the applications process. It's also possible that we will not discuss that, but we certainly will have read it as part of the applications process. So on the day, when you turn up for your interview, there might be lots and lots of things going through your head. You might feel quite nervous, you might feel quite under pressure, you might feel a little bit jittery. That's absolutely fine. We completely understand that this is an unusual experience for you, and we certainly take into account things like nerves when you come into an interview. Try to stay calm, try not to panic. We're not actually terrible human beings who want you to make a fool of yourself and say terrible things at interview. We really want to design the interviews so you have the opportunity, alongside all of the other things you've already told us, to show your best, to show that you can demonstrate this academic ability and academic potential. So listen and take time to think about the question that you've actually been asked. Don't answer the question that you wish we had asked you, the one to which you've prepared a 20-minute speech in response. Actually answer the question that we have asked you and listen to it and think about it. And if you need a few seconds to think about your answer and collect your thoughts, feel free to do so. What might feel like an eternity to you is probably only about 3 or 4 seconds in reality. So do take the time to think about what's being asked. Try and do your best to answer with clarity and with focus. Obviously, we remember that you're nervous, and that can affect people in different ways. So for instance, when I get nervous, I tend to just blather on non-stop and there's no stopping me. So I could just talk for 3 hours and I guarantee there will be very little clarity and focus within it. Whereas some people sort of clam up and get a bit quiet and need to be sort of prompted to respond to things. Either of those things is absolutely fine. We recognise that you might well be a little bit nervous, but try and answer the question that you've been asked. Try and do so with clarity. Try not to go too far off the point. And if you feel as though you've run out of things to say, stop. Your interviewer can always ask you questions if they want to know a little bit more. And on that note, don't be upset if your interviewer then goes on and asks you to explain something in a bit more detail that you've already said. That might well be an indication that you've said something that's quite interesting and they want to sort of delve into in a little bit more detail. So don't worry if someone asks you to say a little bit more. That's not an indication that what you said last time was inadequate. It's just an invitation to say something a little bit extra about what you've already said. So be willing to talk through, be willing to explain, be willing to justify what you've said, and be willing to take the conversation a little bit further. It's a good idea to concentrate on the current question. So this is the moment to sort of channel your inner Roger Federer. So when he loses a point, he doesn't spend the next 20 minutes sort of worrying about losing that point. He moves on and he wins the next one. So this is the kind of mindset that you want to focus on in your interview. So you answer the current question. And you try and concentrate on what's being asked there and exactly what's being prompted and what's being gone through. So even if you think that something earlier on in the interview hasn't gone brilliantly, or even if you're worried about what might be coming next, do your very best to be in the moment and concentrate on exactly what's being asked. It's absolutely fine to ask for clarification if you need to. So if your interviewers, for instance, use a word that you think, I have never heard that word in my entire life, it's not a test of your vocabulary. That is not a problem. So if you want to ask your interviewers what that word means, or what they mean, or whether they can rephrase a question, then feel free to do so. I'm quite guilty of this when I ask questions in interviews. I can, in my enthusiasm for asking the question, ask the longest question in the world. That's my fault as an interviewer, not yours. So if you need to ask for clarification, you should feel absolutely free to do so. There's no problem with that happening. And what matters absolutely is what you're saying, not how you're saying it. We don't engage in personality testing. It's not about how confident you are when you stride. If you stride into the room and declaim your answers like you're some classical orator, none of that is any better than looking at your shoes and just sort of mumbling your answers. It's about what you say, not how you deliver it. And everything that we try and do in the interview is to prompt you to say more and prompt you to say and to think a little bit about what you're saying and what it is that you're trying to argue or what it is that you're trying to solve. And so feel free to self-reflect. Feel free to change your mind. Feel free to say, okay, well, I can think about that problem differently with that new information that you've given me. Or on reflection, my first answer to this was a bit panicked, and actually what I really want to say is this. So think of it as a dialogue. Think of it as an opportunity for you to learn something as much as your interviewer to be able to learn something from you. So it's hopefully something that is really enjoyable as an experience and as a conversation. And as you would do in a conversation, you'd think about what you were saying and you'd respond to what the person you were talking to was saying. It's the same kind of process. So that is all I wanted to say on interviews. I hope that this has been useful, and I really hope it's put your mind at ease about the kinds of things that will be coming your way in an admissions interview. I hope you really enjoy it. I hope that they're really positive experiences for you, and let me wish you the very best of luck. Thank you.